Welcome to Implications of Information Design for Technology-Based Learning. Can everyone hear me? Is it okay? Okay, great. Thanks for showing up this morning. This is our last day. It's been a great conference. I really appreciate being invited here. I bring warm greetings from my hometown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a friendly city, yes indeed, home of the Steel City. Steelers, Penguins, Pirates, we have it all. We also have great universities and great industry. This morning, I would like to give you some ideas about ways that you can use information design in the work that you do. And to that end, I'd like to talk about two questions. First, I'd like to set the stage with some ideas about what information design is all about. I'm assuming that most of you may not have had a chance to take a course in information design, or maybe haven't had a chance to read a book about it yet. So I'd like to give you some ideas about it, and so that you might have some ideas about going forward if this field interests you. And I hope that you'll find that it will. But I'll spend most of my time on what are some of the implications of research in information design for the work that you do. So let's begin. What is information design? Information design is all about the art, the science, and the practice of bringing together word and image so that people can achieve their practical goals for engaging with content. Information design is audience-centered. We really care about communicating effectively with the audiences for whom we write and design. It's results-oriented. We actually want to know whether we've been effective. We don't want to guess. We want evidence. So information design has grown over the years from a kind of intuitive practice, a kind of seat of the pants. This is what we usually do in this organization, and this is how we practice things. It's grown up over the past 2 or 3 decades to be a more robust area where we actually have some research to help guide our practice. We're not there yet. We're not fully, in a sense, blossomed, because we're a new field, but we're on our way. Information design is it's a creative practice about promoting the goals and the values of the people for whom we write and design. Depending on the context in which you work, you might see those folks as readers, students, viewers, citizens, stakeholders, whatever you call them. From our point of view, they are in the same boat because they all want information that they can use and get their jobs done. Information design stands in contrast to fields such as advertising, where the focus is really about promoting the goals and values of the organization. We're not about selling, we're about informing people. And in order to do that, you really need an interdisciplinary perspective. You can see here that we look at everything from cross-cultural communication to applied linguistics to technical and professional communication, with a big emphasis on visual design, writing, and typography. We even look at instructional design, of course, because in many contexts, what we're doing is promoting learning. Some of the genres that information designers work on include these. They range from textbooks and instructions to signs to forms, policies and procedures. I can see that, you might be thinking, wow, this sounds really deadly. These kinds of things are boring and mundane. Well, guess what? Somebody has to design them. If you're in a situation where you need good, clear information, you don't want to fool around. You want someone who has provided you with the advice, with the guidance that you need. And we're here to help. We want to make those forgotten texts clear, those texts that typically don't even get talked about in the academy. If you were taking a course in writing, for example, probably you wouldn't hear much about these genres. We're interested in all of these kinds of goals, instructing and persuading and helping people make comparisons, helping them make good decisions, guiding their way. For example, you might be in a hospital setting. Perhaps you have a doctor's appointment, and you are asked to go to a huge complex where there might be 10 or 15 buildings, and you have to find that doctor's appointment quickly. Information designers have been focused on an area called wayfinding, which provides signage and color-coded information. Sometimes you'll see like a yellow stripe along the wall, along the floor that will guide you through the corridors, allowing you to find what you need. Over the years, information design has developed from kind of a grassroots activity, primarily in the US and the UK, to an international, much broader than US and UK. Let me give you just a few examples. This is from a woman, her name is Carla Spinillo. She's one of the leading information designers from Brazil, and she studies the design of medical information, looking carefully at how the text and the graphics map onto one another. Many times when we take pills, it's hard to figure out what the heck we're supposed to do. And so here she has found that, in this case, the text and the graphics are not aligned. And in order to be able to make sense of it, especially if you have trouble with reading or trouble with seeing, it's really important that that text and graphic sync up. So this is an example of a paper document. Another kind of way that information designers do their work is to create texts for the built environment. And probably the most famous person who has done that is a Dutch information designer by the name of Paul Maxenaar. He has created the signage for the Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Here we have a few examples of his work. On the left, top left, you see that lovely I Am Amsterdam. You see that the second you hit the tarmac with that beautiful Frutiger font. Frutiger is one of the great fonts that many designers like. It's called F-R-U-T-I-G-E-R. It's named after Adrian Frutiger, who created it. When you get closer to the airport, you see that Schiphol sign. When you get inside, everything is well signed. All of the paths through the airport are clear, and it tells you, for example, at the top of each of those letters, how long it takes to get to each gate. Information designers have been thinking about every touch point, every place that you might walk, every place that you might stop and say, ooh, what should I do now? Where should I go? Where's the baggage claim? Where do they have an elevator? Where's the escalator? So all those kinds of icons are designed by information designers. We care about how people see our text. Legibility is really important to us. And so, for example, we test the quality of the typography under different conditions. Here you can see that the departures gate has been degraded in that second image so that we can find out whether the text actually works for people with low vision, or if the lights go out in the airport. Now, what you see there is you can still see that word departure even though it's fuzzy. And the reason you can see it is because it has good letter spacing. That's the distance between each letter. Notice the letters are not touching. Okay, so if they were squished together, you wouldn't be able to figure that out. But so they test these things under very different kinds of conditions. Now, information design has grown up primarily in the graphic design field, where people who were taught originally to make pretty pictures, make cute posters, make happy things for companies that want to sell you things, who have shifted their priorities to usability, legibility, clarity, understandability. Those folks have hooked up with plain language people, people who are interested in the clarity of the written word. And most of these folks come from the area of writing, editing, and journalism. Plain language And this is a definition that has just come out. It's been struggled over by many organizations. I know you know how things go in organizations. Sometimes it's hard to make a decision. Communication is in plain language when the language, structure, and design are so clear that people can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. Two organizations that I want to point your attention to. One is the Center for Plain Language. They're here, right here in Washington. I was on their board of directors for over a decade. They're dedicated to trying to get the U.S. government to wake up and create clear information for the U.S. citizens. As most of you who are from the U.S. know that we have trouble with our income tax forms, with letters that come out from the Veterans Administration, with information about food stamps or Medicare or health care, Obamacare. All of these things have been confusing, okay? And we want to help encourage government in a kind of militant way where we're really there bugging the Congress people to change the law to make it possible for these government agencies to be forced to be clear. And one of our big accomplishments, and that we're very proud of, is that in 2010 we got President Obama to sign the Plain Writing Act. And in that act, he said that government documents must be clear, concise, and understandable. As a result of that, organizations all over Washington and all of the satellite places around the country have been very vigilant in trying to get it together to make their government documents more responsive to people. We're a bit behind, actually, in the U.S. I just came back a month ago from Sweden, where I was a visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg. And I was part of my work, I was on loan to do various talks at other universities, but also at the Swedish government agency called their Language Institute. And believe it or not, they actually have people whose full-time job is to worry about the clarity of Swedish for the citizens. And in fact, it's even written into their constitution that all Swedish people must be able to understand what's coming from their government. What a concept. If we could only have that here, it would be amazing. So we believe that clarity is good for all readers, and that using plain language can be helpful for less able readers, for second language learners, for expert readers and busy professionals. And we don't just say this, we actually have the data to prove it. You might be thinking to yourself, well, what do experts need plain language for? They're good readers. Well, let me tell you, even judges need plain language. And the now late, great Antonin Scalia, who was part of our U.S. Supreme Court, argued vigorously that even Supreme Court judges want plain language. And the reason why? Because they are busy. They have a job to do. They don't want to screw around wading through stuff that's impossible to read, that secondary attorneys have created that are confusing. So he was very insistent on making sure that everything that came across his desk was clear. And believe me, all of his folks around him understood that. We also want to worry about those busy professionals because they have so many things to look at, so many competing sources of content that are coming to them. They don't have time to read a lot of stuff. If your information is not well designed, it will not get read. But we're interested in making sure that message is right and making sure it's easy to understand, and crucially, that it encourages trust. We are not interested in alternative facts. We believe that it's really crucial to make sure that our messages are credible, not just easy to understand, but true, accurate. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, because it has to do with all kinds of readers. Even little children need this. So over the years, plain language and information design have kind of grown up separately, but over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen a little bit of a merge. In fact, this September, there will be the first international conference in Graz, Australia, that will bring together plain language people and information designers. What do they want? We want evidence about what works in terms of writing and design and their integration, from the word level to the whole text level, from typography to whole text graphic features. I have been interested in trying to bring this work together. It's a big chore. I have assembled over 400 articles that I've read that support the research in these various areas, and right now I'm working on a new book on evidence-based plain language and information design that I hope will be easy to understand for people in business as well as people in the academy who might want to take advantage of what we've learned. So let me share with you now some of the ideas about 3 major areas: writing, design, and typography. I'll talk about writing and then typography and then a bit about design. First, some evidence about writing. Well, there's a lot to say, and so I'm going to just give you the highlights because it really does take a book. One of the most robust findings from the research is that to make text easy to understand, we need to favor short words, high-frequency words. By that I mean words that are the most frequent in a given language, words that people hear all the time, they hear on the TV, on the radio, in the newspaper, they see. The more you see a word, the higher frequency it will be. We want those high-frequency words because people tend not to get it when we use obscure, low-frequency words. Every language actually has been building thesauruses about these different kinds of words, and you can actually look up the high-frequency words in English and find out how frequent your word choices are. We want to favor those easy words, the concrete words, over the long words, low-frequency words, hard words, and abstract words. Another piece of the work that comes out of the research is that we want to use the active voice as much as we can. Active voice is much more personal, and for students it's crucial because it's important that they know who the agent of the sentence is. When we use the passive voice, we tend to bury who's doing the talking, who's doing the action, and that creates ambiguity. And in some cases, it creates suspicion. When you see that in, for example, financial information, a lot of passive voice, you wonder to yourself, is this person trying to tell me something that maybe isn't really honest, isn't really true? When they bury who's doing the talking, it raises our antenna. And so passive voice is really not the way to go unless you really want to put the object of the sentence into focus. Another thing that comes out of the research on writing is that we want to prefer right-branching sentences. When you think about a sentence, it kind of has a trunk. The subject and the verb are the trunk, and the stuff that hangs off of it are the branches. And so the question is, which is easier, left branching or right branching? And it turns out that right branching is easier. Let's take a look at these 2 sentences. The first on the left, Governor Eliot Spitzer, whose rise to political power as a fierce enforcer of ethics in public life was undone by revelations of his own involvement with prostitutes, resigned on Wednesday, becoming the first New York governor to leave office amid scandal in nearly a century. Notice how I'm almost running out of breath by the end of that sentence. Notice that I don't get to the word resigned until way, way, way into the sentence. So we're waiting for that verb to hook it up. Versus the right-branching sentence, Governor Eliot Spitzer resigned on Wednesday, becoming the first New York governor, and you see how that resigned allows you to hook that information on to that verb and makes it easier to process. We break it up, we reduce the cognitive load, and I would recommend moving toward right-branching. In the academic world, we're often given A's for have heavily embedded sentences. It's part of the culture of the academy to promote long sentences and complex words and tricky ways to say things. It might impress our colleagues, but it doesn't impress our students nor the rest of the world. So I recommend that you aim for mostly short sentences, and by that I mean roughly 15, 20 words for a sentence. Once they start, 25 is okay. Once they start getting up toward 30, 35, people run into real trouble understanding them. We also want to include personal pronouns and human interest elements. There's lots of evidence that shows that people like to see those personal pronouns in headings, those you can do this and you can do that. They want to see them in stories. They like narratives. It's much more engaging for people. We also want to favor those vivid verbs, not the verbs that have been turned into nouns, what we call nominalizations, such as legislation instead of legalize. When you see the tion ending, you know that you're running into a longer word that has been turned from a verb into a noun. We really need, as academics, to stop talking like this. Hence our adoption of Omni and Winans' view of racial formation, seeing race as a matter of both social structure and cultural representation, and our inclusion of the term racialized to emphasize the historicity of the discursive formation. Now, that actually was printed in Harvard Educational Review. This is what I mean by the socialization of the academy to lean toward this kind of language. When I was at Carnegie Mellon, my boss used to say to me, Schriver, it's just too plain. There's no nuance there. And okay, let me make it complicated and then I'll have some nuance. It's not just adults who are turned off by this. It's also children who feel locked out of the worlds described in their textbooks through depersonalized and abstract prose used to describe them. And this is a quote from two famous fellows who work in children's literature. Another thing about writing is that we want to keep those headings descriptive because they serve as cues for the content. And with the material that you're creating, it's absolutely crucial because those headings allow people to predict what's coming next. They catch their interest. They should be really distinct from one another and reflect your perspective on the text and provide essentially key words for access, especially when you're putting your stuff up on YouTube, people are searching the web, trying to find stuff. It's really important that you've cataloged everything that could be searched, and so people can find your stuff. But too often we find that people are using headings like these, which mean almost nothing. And so we want to avoid those ones that are vague. And be aware of your tone and your voice, and particularly the persona that you project as you're creating your e-learning content. By persona, I mean the voice behind the text that signals who is doing the speaking. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, it's obvious who's doing the speaking, I'm the teacher. Well, in some cases, that might be the case, but you might also be creating a standalone object where they don't have any clue who you are. They're making guesses and trying to figure out, should I listen to this person another minute? Is this the right person for this topic? Most of the topics that we're writing stuff about, there are more people who are doing it than just you. You have competition for your e-learning materials. And so you're going to want to make sure that your tone is appropriate and that you know how people feel and believe and thinking about your topic. So we want to worry about both cognition and affect. I explored this notion of cognition and affect in my first book, Dynamics in Document Design, and I want to show you just one example from that book. Although it's old, there's a couple of, it's an oldie but goodie, and I want to show you one example of something that I studied almost 20 years ago now. And it will reveal to you what I've just been talking about regarding persona. This is a brochure that was written by a government agency here in Washington to discourage young children from taking drugs. It was aimed at an audience of 8 to 13-year-olds. And there were many, many brochures like this in the set that this Health and Human Services group were creating. And at the time, there was a big campaign called Just Say No to Drugs. Some of you will remember that. Well, there was an industry behind that of creating documents, posters, flyers, all sorts of things that were sent out to schools and libraries and community centers to discourage students from taking drugs. This is one of them, we call it Snappy Answers. Notice the first heading, want some alcohol or other drugs? Now ask yourself, would anyone who is pusher of drug say that? Want some alcohol or other drugs? I don't think so. Okay, so people were, what is going on here? So we thought maybe we should actually study these documents and take a look at what students think. So we studied some 300 students from a big area around Pittsburgh with focus groups, think aloud protocols, surveys, questionnaires, anything we could do. We videotaped them, we recorded them, and these are some of the comments that students made about this particular brochure. If you take a look, I know this is a little small and I apologize, but I couldn't get it to go any bigger without it jumping off the page. But let me point to you to the top right, where there is a line pointing at the heading alcohol and drugs. One of the students said, "What are these little triangles?" "Oh, no, I guess this is supposed to be acid." "Well, why do they use drugs to decorate the letters if it's not trying to make drugs seem like it's fun?" So here were these designers thinking, oh, it'd be cute to put some triangles on these letters. Kids just jumped on it and said, oh, it must be acid. Exactly what the authors did not want. If you look on the left-hand side, and you can read through these answers, they're hilarious in some ways. If you look at the first one about, no thanks, I'd rather walk my pet python. Kids said, well, it sounds like a joke to me. Some people would just say, well, not with you, but these say, I have to walk my python. The answers are kind of stupid. It sounds like the author is a nerdy white guy who is cooped up in his office too long. Maybe that's why they're talking about drugs as bad. They could say blow by blow, what happens. Okay, so notice here that the teenager is commenting about the person who wrote the text. We normally would say, well, why aren't they just focusing on what it says? Why aren't they just comprehending? Okay, well, the agencies wanted us to hit them with everything we had and to do comprehension tests, and there were a lot of different brochures in this line. And so, for example, one of the brochures was about using crack cocaine, and they wanted us to make sure those students knew that if they took crack cocaine, that it would enter the bloodstream in 12 seconds. And we were like, okay, we'll ask that question if you want us to ask it. So we surveyed students, and guess what? They had comprehension of almost 90%. But when we came to the satisfaction issue, 0. The kids hated the stuff that they understood. So there was a mismatch between comprehension and actually being motivated to do something based on that. So my message to you is, really, you need to think about the persona that you're projecting. You might think that it's not a big deal, but maybe it is a big deal. And some of the things as I was preparing for this talk, I was looking at some of the software that's available to you, and some of the avatars that are provided in the software were a whole lot like the pictures that I saw in the drug education literature 20 years ago. And I was thinking, good grief, but if you need to use them, I would suggest use them sparingly, and if you can, find something a bit better. Let me move now to talk a little bit about typography. A lot of people who ask me questions about typography usually focus on what typeface family should I use? Should I use serif faces or sans serif faces? Well, we used to think that serif typefaces were the most legible and that they were better for textbook design, for newspaper design, for all sorts of texts that we see every day. And in fact, there was good reason to believe that. In the 1930s, a fellow by the name of Miles Tinker did a ton of research on typography, and he claimed appropriately at the time that serif faces were more legible. And so in the US, we picked up on that big time. In Europe, there has been a tradition of sans serif. That research has come under question because the legibility of the text was not too good. There was no control for the size of the type and the distance of the reader to the display, and there was all sorts of sort of noise in the data. Today, we believe that when we're looking at type on screen, and we have these high-res, high-retina displays, when the resolution is good, sans serif and serif are equally legible, equally fast to read. So it's a draw. You really can use either, but I would recommend to opt for sans serif online. Why? Because it has much less of a tendency to close up on you, to tighten up in terms of the interletter spacing, the character spacing. So we want to avoid type that looks squished when it's bold-faced, when it's touching or almost touching. It becomes a problem not only for our low-level readers or people who have trouble with vision, but also for screen readers. And conversely, we don't want type that appears too thin. This is from a website from an online learning place in university, and you can see that it's pretty hard to see that. Here is an example from a website that I think could use both better graphics, writing, and typography. I was trying to figure out what the heck this particular website is promoting. I thought that it was a school by the name of ACE Graduate School. It actually, the ACE is a verb. ACE Graduate School, they're selling a book. Notice the typography is pulling apart and that there is space in that third line between the different words. Typographers call those rivers. And it happens when you justify the text right and try to make it look like a block. Justified text is a bad idea. Ragged right has been proven again and again to be much more legible. So when you're choosing a type in Word or PowerPoint or whatever application you're using, pull it on to the left. It's the first thing that you can select. Notice also the disparity between those red arrows and things that you can choose. Be a graphic designer, be an editor. What does that have to do with pointing at that graphic? What is that graphic? What is that graphic behind that reach higher? Okay, so it doesn't line up. You can't figure out what the heck this group is all about. And when you look at the last sentence of that paragraph, it says, well, the program that you want to, furthermore, this book will equip you to think more carefully about yourself, why you want to go to graduate school, what program you want to offer, and why the school should be dying to have you around. Really bad writing, okay? Really bad. It doesn't make us want to reach higher. Okay, let's look at some issues related to visuals. When I was looking at these various software programs like Captivate and Storyline, I was perusing a variety of tutorials online using e-learning to learn about the kinds of things that you do. And one of the things that really annoyed me, I have to say, is that more than one instructor said, well, now it's time to dump in your content, and if you want to, you could add flair by including a visual. Well, hello. Graphics are not about adding flair. Some of you may have seen Jennifer Aniston in this hilarious movie called Office Space, where she is required by her boss to wear 30 pieces of flair instead of 15 pieces. There are these little buttons that happy, oh, I'm so perky, and all this horrible nonsense. And that's flair. Graphics are about creating meaning, not about adding flair. In the old days, people used to call them visual aids, and that was because we believed that it was supplementary to the verbal text. The verbal text had primacy, so it was just assisting. They're not visual aids, they're equal partners, and in many cases, they're more useful than the words, and that's where the judgment comes in. So I recommend to you that when you are thinking about developing your content, that you start out with a content audit, looking at all of the types of things that you want to present to your learners, those explanations and examples and equations, videos and animations, and ask yourself, how should they align? What should be talking to what? If you're presenting content that will be displayed on a larger screen, you've got a lot more freedom because you can have a horizontal layout and actually have your visual speaking to the text. If you're designing for a mobile application, it's more likely that you're going to have to go vertically. And so what we want to do is to construct an organization that will be predictable and flexible across platforms. I recommend strongly that you try out your content across platforms. Some people are arguing these days for responsive design, which allows you to flexibly move your content from one platform to another, and that in fact maybe we should start with a mobile application and then move backwards to the larger frame of our high-screen res monitors and our high-screen laptops. That verdict is still out. It's not quite clear that people can get the same content and the same experience on a phone. We're trying, but I think that it's still very useful to think about designing your content for those larger screens. Let's look now at some of the things that you might do with visuals. One of the things that you see in a lot of e-learning materials are visuals that have too much content in them. Here's one from a children's lesson on differences between an elk and a deer. And notice that on the left, we're showing the whole head of the elk, but it's better if we crop that elk so that we can show that guy's beard, make him distinct so that little kids can see, hey, what is that chinny chin chin guy? And he doesn't look like a deer at all. So we can crop for focus. We can also crop for emphasis. Here are two figures from the Cirque du Soleil performance that came through Pittsburgh. Notice on the left, because of the distance, it looks as though those fans are growing out of the platform. But actually, those huge, beautiful seashell-like things are held up by individuals. You don't see that until you get the crop version. So if you wanted to put emphasis on how athletic these folks are and how much weight they have to carry around, you would want to crop it. So before you opt for a template, I think it's really crucial that you try to devise a typographic scheme and a way to present your content that is unique. The themes that I've seen so far, many of them are a bit tired. They look like rehabs of PowerPoint. And maybe that's not so bad in some contexts, but for your really important e-learning experiences, you really want to do something better. And so you might want to work with a designer if you have the opportunity to at your university. Those folks would help you figure out, for example, using color navigation. using color coding for your navigation. The top bar might be, for example, a more business setting, a more staid, where people are, unfortunately, sometimes a little bit gray and beige. In the second bar, you'll see that the more pastel colors might be suitable for lessons for a child or a cookbook, but you can see that even color would signal to you the type of genre that might be used. Another piece of data, or not the piece of advice I would recommend, is just assume people are going to jump around the text and will want to figure out where they are. I looked at a lot of different videos on the Khan Academy, and I have to say that quite a few of them did not have any information about where I was. I would just search on a topic, and I ended up in the middle of a lesson, but I didn't know I was in the middle of a lesson. And so it's important that we provide things like percent done indicators, you are here cues, back to home, the same kind of thing that you would find in good signage in an airport. I took this picture just 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, when I came into Reagan National. Notice the big red dot thing that looks like an hour little magnifying glass. They have that jumping. It's animated when you see it, so you know exactly where you are. And we want the same kind of feeling when we get to e-learning environments. We want to see how far we've gone, where we've been. Let's turn now to a few comments about pictures. And what we used to say is that make sure you use a lot of pictures because they convey more than words. The old adage is a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, research suggests that's only partly true. A picture is only worth 1,000 words if the reader can interpret it and if it functions rhetorically to support the meaning. And so we want to make sure that we get the right picture, not just any old clip art. We want to make sure that it supports the rhetorical function that we are trying to achieve, explain, instruct, elaborate, help compare, all those sorts of things. The research suggests that words and pictures are more effective than either words or pictures alone. And so it's a kind of powerhouse. And there's lots of things to say about the relationships between words and pictures, but I don't really have time to go into them. Another important factor is the contrast. And it's when you're designing your e-learning experiences, you want to emphasize the relationships between light and dark, worrying about the contrast ratio. That is, the ratio between the light and the dark. So I recommend that you try out different options. A light color and a dark text color, for example, trying light text on a dark background, or dark text on a light background. The kind of thing we don't want is dark on dark or light on light. And we don't want colors that wash out when we have a screen where the brightness has been turned up. All of these things have been looked at in lots of detail, and you can, there are 2 websites here I recommend checking out if you are unfamiliar with this area. You can actually pick any old color you want, plug it into the website, and it will tell you how good the contrast will be if you choose 2 colors. Another thing about contrast is our videos. Sometimes you'll see things like this. This video was this dark to begin with. It's not just dimmed at the beginning. It was dark all the way through. We have to worry about images that are too dark that makes it really hard for people to understand. We also want to worry about images that have hot spots. I don't know what the photographer was thinking here, but he or she wanted to show that they had a big audience, and apparently they got the lights mostly. What does this need? It needs desperate cropping, and it needs to bring up the contrast and bring up the color. So there are lots of things that you can do in Photoshop and other applications that can fix something like this. Now, many of us may say, well, I'm not an artist, I can't do that. But you can. You can work with background images, for example, that serve as chapter dividers or theme dividers. Here's an example of someone who wanted to use what we'll call drapey trees in there as a chapter divider. Notice they've started with a first draft with this pink centered text. It's too small, it's over the tree, you can't really make it out. In the second draft, they moved the position of the type to a better focal position. Research suggests that many people in the West read in a Z pattern. If you were to scroll across the top, down, and over, it hits it right at the Z. The third draft popped that forward by putting a screen behind it, a small label, and then using a feathering technique in Photoshop to make it blend in a bit with the atmosphere that the person was trying to create. You can do this in 45 minutes, really. It won't take you long to try out different things. Another thing you can try is to color code your transition and branching slides to create a family of cues. And here's an example of something I used when I was giving a lecture at the European Commission in Brussels a couple years ago. We were talking about various issues related to writing and designing and translating and testing. Notice that I kept the image stable. I kept the type for the particular words we were talking about stable, and then I had help with my friends who helped me translate these particular words into different languages. And it worked very well because it allowed consistency. It builds a theme. It allows people to say, oh, I get it. Another technique you might try is using small multiples. Small multiples can be used to direct attention and to enable comparisons. Let me show you what I mean. In case you haven't heard of small multiples, it's a technique that was designed by Yale professor and statistician Edward Tufte. It's basically a reduced size graphic that resemble kind of frames of a movie, where the design structure, that is its physical shape, is stable, and what's inside of it changes. But you are able to look across it and then see a constancy that allows you to see changes in data or an object. Let's look at an example of that. Here is small multiples for a new book that is coming out called The Fallen Warlord. Excuse me, this just went crazy on me. There it went. Okay, yay. Notice across the top the small multiples. These are the books to come. It allows you to preview. It allows you to see in a snapshot where this fallen warlord's journey might take him. Here's another example. Here, small multiples, say that 15 times, reveal that only some movies repeat their initial success. So here we have the movie at the top of the little graph and 3 movies, first release, second release, third release, and we can see that movies like Star Wars really held their audience where Planet of the Apes and The Matrix went off the deep end. And so in a glance, you can see these comparisons. You could imagine you could use them for something to show in your class. Here's another example of small multiples. Here, the company is allowed to see which tasks customers had trouble with before and after usability testing. This was a study that we did a while back for Sony, where we were looking at different languages and how people were able to understand different tasks for using a stereo. In a glance, you can see that connecting the stereo and recording on one side of a tape and creating a mixtape were the hardest task for people, and that across the board, people got better. So the small multiple technique is useful for presenting data, but also can be used in kind of a fun way. Here I took a duck and just recolored him 3 ways. You can do this in 5 minutes in PowerPoint, but it allows you to make a quick point that you might be able to find useful. You could imagine leading with a discussion of cognition and how, although there are many things that we are different about in terms of human beings and the things that individual differences and preferences and things, there are many, many things that we share. And so I hope that I've provided to you some ideas about different ways that you could use writing, typography, and visual design in your e-learning experiences. And the takeaway I would say is that information design research, and plain language can help you develop, integrate, and evaluate your content, but it can also improve your students' experience across the whole text, across the visual and the verbal, increasing their comprehension, increasing their satisfaction, and crucially, increasing their willingness to persist. Thank you very much.